Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. I am one of their hosts, and you hear me every Friday. That is Ethan, and I hope everyone's having a wonderful day. Now, on the day that I'm recording this, a lot of things have been popping in and out of the NFL talking circles, and if you're not too familiar with the Washington Post, they just released an article on the Redskins that is pretty telling about a lot of sexual misconduct happening over the past 13 years within the organization, and it leading to a lot of people being fired or let go and or retiring from their positions over the past few years. And we got a lot of insight via that Washington Post article, and I would encourage everyone to go check it out and read it, as it's important to recognize that at high corporate positions, things like this happen, and it's not just circumstance. It can happen anywhere. It doesn't have to be just big NFL offices. It also can be your local Office Depot, or it can be anywhere that has business that have women, and majority of the front office is men. It can happen. So I encourage everyone to go read that article. It's really good. It's well written. And, of course, it wasn't what we all kind of expected, as we thought it might be even more, damning than it actually was. It's still very important to read, and I think everybody should check it out. But today, on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, we will be discussing many different elements of fantasy football. And one of them has to deal with beginners, so we're going to do some beginner stuff, and also looking at franchise tags and more fantasy football wide receiver stuff, and then some tight end things, and that's how we're going to wrap up the podcast. So we are going to start with franchise tags over the NFL over the last few days, because the franchise tag time frame has ended. As you know, Wednesday was the last day, as that was the deadline for franchise tag players to potentially get long-term deals passed at 4 p.m., and that didn't end up happening for most of them. So here's the status on those who are tagged currently. So Shaq Barrett is an edge rusher for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he signed a franchise tag on Tuesday that he would be signing the tag. And the team announced Wednesday that he did, and then he also filed a grievance believing he should be designated as a defensive end rather than a linebacker, and the grievance is ongoing. NFL Network's Ian Rappaport reported the Bucs pass rusher told NFL Network on Tuesday that he was not hopeful the two sides would get a deal done, and one did not. However, Barrett's agent Drew Rosenhaus told Rappaport that there will not be a long-term deal at this time, but we are optimistic that Shaq's future in Tampa is long-term. Next is Kenyon Drake, running back for Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals running back was slapped with a transition tag earlier this year. Drake and Arizona are not close on a long-term deal, but their deadline to agree to terms is not until July 22nd at 4 p.m. Rappaport reported, nonetheless, Drake tweeted, and focus wasn't centered on an extension, but in preparing for the season and staying healthy along with everyone else. So his words via tweet, I'm not too concerned about signing an extension currently. He tweeted that that'll come in due time. Right now, I'm focused on every day getting in the best shape of my life to help this team win football games and play winning football. Everything else will run its course. Stay safe, wash your hands, and wear a mask. Bud Dupree, edge rusher for the Pittsburgh Steelers, signed a franchise tag, and Dupree signed his franchise tag on April 23rd. However, the pass rusher is filing a grievance as well, like Shaq, with hopes that he will be paid as a defensive end rather than a linebacker. So the reason why defensive ends or people who want to be classified as defensive end over a linebacker in the NFL is because the payment threshold for a franchise tag for both of those positions are about $3 to $4 million apart, and that's a big difference for a lot of guys because a franchise tag technically is guaranteed money, and you want to make the most in 1 year that you can, and kind of being reclassified may be a way as the NFL trying to, find a way to get out of having to pay these guys more money than they have to, while these guys definitely have the skill sets of a linebacker. They definitely rush the passer way more, and it's all about how we see the depth of the 4-3 or the 3-4. Like, nobody really cares what you are in those sort of scenarios because what you do is rush the passer, and that's what a lot of guys end up showing to executives in these type of meetings that, hey, I rushed the passer, I should be paid as an edge rusher. So next on the list, AJ Green. He has yet to sign his franchise tag, and that is still ongoing. So we'll see if he does end up signing it or coming back to Cincinnati. We'll see. Anthony Harris signed a franchise tag and on April 17th, and Rappaport and NFL Tom Pizzero reported that Harris would not reach a long-term deal with the Vikings and would play out the 2020 season on the tag. Derrick Henry agreed to a long-term deal. He's one of the few who signed his franchise tag back in April on the 2nd and agreed to a long-term contract just ahead of the deadline for 4 years, $50 million. So that's pretty big news coming out of the Derrick Henry camp for multiple reasons. You can look at this as a benchmark for how running backs in the next class are looking to get paid, and that is not a lot of money you would expect, right? For somebody who is basically the best at his position, had the hottest streak of a running back we've seen at his position in the last year or so, to only get paid 4 years, $50 million, I believe 25 is guaranteed, so half of it is guaranteed. But it shows that this is where this position is at. And we know that running back is not as valued as other positions on the football field, and it's just getting kind of worse and worse as years go on. And it's really telling when it's guys who aren't really pass catch efficient. So Derrick Henry's not the biggest pass catcher out the backfield. I mean, he's capable of doing it, but they don't ask of him to do that. They have Deion Lewis for that, or they had him. I believe they still have him. And you see it across the league. Like, Christian McCaffrey received a really, really big-time bill for a running back. But that's because if you look at Christian McCaffrey's statistics from last year, he rivals up with a lot of top-level wide receivers. He is a different category in of itself. His skill set propels him in a different category. And that's why it's so different to look at what he's capable of doing on a weekly basis than Derrick Henry. Because Derrick Henry, we know, is a bell cow. We know he is a traditional running back. We know that Tennessee's offense is really heavily predicated on a Derrick Henry. But even when your offense is predicated on a really high-class, high-volume running back, you have to keep in mind that you have to pay basically everyone else around that running back to keep him basically as fresh and as humanly possible ready to carry the load. So that means you have to invest in the linemen surrounding him. You have to invest Of course, in the quarterback, you have to invest in wide receivers to take away the threat that it's just going to be the Derrick Henry show, because we all know it's going to be the Derrick Henry show. And if you don't invest in things that will make Derrick Henry a better player anyway, then all you're doing is just paying him a lot of money to essentially look like Le'Veon Bell from last year. And this is not a knock at Le'Veon Bell. This is just the Jets situation. They don't have a lot of pieces around Le'Veon to make Le'Veon what he was in Pittsburgh, because I still believe he has the ability to be what he was in Pittsburgh. But the talent in Pittsburgh compared to the New York Jets are like apples to oranges. They're almost completely opposite ends of the spectrum as far as situations. Derrick Henry and the Tennessee Titans are a good team, and they had a really, really hot run. We have no idea if their offense is sustainable the way it is, and I'm sure there's going to be changes. We are not sure what we're going to see from A.J. Brown. We are not sure what we're going to see from Ryan Tannehill. We are not sure if Corey Davis really is going to find himself being a quality NFL wide receiver. There are so many different variables alongside that offense. The only constant is that Derrick Henry is a good running back, and they had to get that deal done, because for Derrick Henry's side, you only have so many years to show off maximum potential as a running back. Because at this point, I believe Derrick Henry's 28. I could be wrong on that. Let me see if I can get that right real quick. But if he is as old as I think he is, which I think he's 28, he is at a point to where, no, he's 26. I'm 2 years off. So he's almost to the point to where once he gets to 28, things start to teeter off as far as how people feel about what your ability is. Once you reach 30, it drops off dramatically at how people feel about you at that position. So things will definitely change over time. And for the actual front office and the team, they have to realize that Derrick Henry is great for now, and they probably have a good four serviceable years out of him until there's a significant drop off. And you can't give somebody basically more than $50 million for 4 years when the production is going to teeter off by age 30, and a longer deal than that would have really shown itself ugly head. And I believe it's all going to be front loaded anyway, because in the back load, they're probably just going to restructure like most teams do. Okay, next on this list, Hunter Henry is tight end, Los Angeles Chargers. He signed his franchise tag. He didn't really expect a deal to get done, and a deal did not get done, so he will play out on his 1 year deal. Chris Jones is one of the other few players who ended up signing a long-term deal. He agreed to a 4-year deal worth $85 million on Tuesday, just a day out from the deadline. Then we have Matthew Judon, edge rusher from Baltimore Ravens, who signed a franchise tag. He agreed to sign his franchise tag in May 28th, and he plays the outside linebacker position and defensive end. Will earn $16.8 million on the tag, and a midpoint between the rate of linebackers and defensive ends. And this is basically a compromise from the Baltimore Ravens and Matthew Judon's camp, because Matthew Judon probably wanted to be paid as a defensive end, but they didn't want to do that, so they had to compromise. And they found some way to work in the middle, because I believe linebackers on the franchise tag make about $14 million, and I believe defensive ends make like $17 million. So there was a compromise somewhere along that line. Then we have the Yannick Ngakoue, defensive end for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's yet to sign his franchise tag, and he has vowed not to play for the Jaguars at all this season, and that remains interest. There remains interest from teams in trading for the D end. Ian Rappaport reported Tuesday that Ngakoue swap would be difficult and complicated to pull off, but it's not impossible. And less than 2 hours before the deadline, Pizzero reported per sources that Jacksonville had received multiple trade offers for Ngakoue, including involving a Pro Bowl player. However, the Jaguars have not received enough value to deal Ngakoue, and they are in no rush to deal him at this moment. Now we move on. There's Dak Prescott. He signed his franchise tag for $30 million, and he did not reach a long-term deal. Brandon Sheriff signed his franchise tag on April 8th, and there was no long-term deal. Justin Simmons signed a franchise tag, and he was not expected to reach a long-term deal with Denver. John Thuney for the New England Patriots also signed a franchise tag in March, and he was not expected to reach a long-term deal with New England. And, of course, it didn't happen. And then finally, Leonard Williams, also a defensive lineman, signed a franchise tag, and he signed it on April 22nd and was expected to play out on the 1-year deal per Ian Rappaport. So that is your franchise tag roundup for the 2020 season. So there should be no more big-time franchise news aside from people who are currently holding out and may not play on the tag, like AJ Green. So if anything changes, of course, we'll let you know. But without any further ado, we're going to take our first break of the evening and come back and talking about wide receivers and 100 or wide receivers in 1,000 yards, and which ones are you going to be looking to target in 2020 for fantasy football? This is the GSMC.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, we're back, GSMC fantasy footballers and football nation. We are going to discuss further into wide receivers in fantasy football, in the spear, in the circumference. It's spherical. In the spear of fantasy football, wide receivers are a big talking point because you know what the main meat and potatoes of fantasy football are, and that are wide receivers and running backs being the meat, wide receivers being the really, really hearty, rich potatoes. So our friends from Pro Football Focus have a fantasy football breakdown of NFL wide receivers projected to go over 1,000 yards in 2020. And they have it broken up essentially as locks, guys who can, guys who may be looking on the outside looking in, and guys who are probably going to fall underneath 1,000 yards this season. So that, without that being left said, here we go. Locks for 1,000 yards in the receiving category. 8 wide receivers are truly elite fantasy options and virtual locks to reach 1,000 receiving yards. Julio Jones, 1,628 last year. Efficiency metric of yards per route run may as well be named after Julio. He has led all wide receivers in that category in 5 of the last 7 years and never ranked outside of the top 5. Julio Jones and Michael Thomas were the only players to have more than 40 catches of at least 15 yards last season. He is a lock. Michael Thomas, 1,541 yards last year. And they say do not overthink this one. Michael Thomas just set the NFL record with 149 catches in a season while also recording the league's best efficiency at 2.88 yards per route run. He is the undisputed wide receiver number 1 taken off the board. Next is Mike Evans. Over the last 6 NFL seasons, Mike Evans has never had less than 1,000 yards receiving. And expect the streak to reach 7 straight years as Bruce Arians' aerial attack creates more than enough volume to support both Godwin and Evans. And while Evans only caught 59% of his passes in 2019, he still averaged 2.30 yards per route run, 7th most due to big play ability. Evans had 32 catches of 20-plus yards last season. That was 6th most in the NFL at the position. Chris Godwin, his partner in crime, right next to him. The God himself comes off a breakoff season as Pro Football Focus reigning highest graded wide receiver in the entire league. Godwin is the NFL's premier slot wide receiver when he racked up 838 of his receiving yards in just 14 games, 2nd most. Since 2016, Tom Brady has had 6,041 passing yards to slot receivers, 443 more than any other quarterback. It's about to happen. Get ready. Kenny Golladay is next. Kenny Golladay, blossomed in his 3rd season and became the league's best wide receiver on contested catches, where he hauled in a league-high 26 balls for 429 yards. It feels like Golladay has already broken out, considering he finished as wide receiver 9 last season, yet he only had 65 catches on 113 targets. With the return of a healthy Matthew Stafford, Golladay is a strong bet to blow past last year's 1,190 receiving yards and cement himself among the NFL's premier pass catchers. Imagine Galladay's stats if there were 80 or 90 ball catches in his stat line instead of 65. Next, Tyreek Hill, so operating as the number 1 wide receiver in Patrick Mahomes' passing attack, has its perks. Hill only played in 12 games last season due to a broken collarbone, but when healthy, he was wildly productive with an average of 2.45 yards per route ran, 4th most amongst all wide receivers. Hill's cheetah speed makes him a threat to take any ball to the house, and he has 6 catches for 40-plus yards last season, and that was 6th most. Next, Devontae Adams with 1,330 yards last season. The Packers' biggest offseason addition to their receiving core was Devin Funchess, which means that Adams will once again be the target hog, and he had 89 targets in weeks 9 through 17 after returning from injury last season, 2nd most in the NFL and only 4 less than Michael Thomas. Adams is a legitimate favorite to lead the league in targets, and he is also very efficient and averaged a 2.33 yards per route ran last season, which was 6th most. Allen Robinson is only 3 wide receivers had more targets than him in weeks 9 through 17 last season. That was Michael Thomas, Adams, and then there was Robinson. So Robinson is a target monster for the Bears, and that kind of volume should be an automatic 1,000 yards. He has overcome shoddy quarterback play his entire career, and it's hard to believe that Nick Foles could be the best quarterback Robinson has ever played with. Robinson is a contested catch artist, racking up 40 since 2018, and that's 3rd most behind Julio and Kenny Golladay. And these are guys coming up now who should go over 1,000 yards. So these are 10 wide receivers and are strong bets to surpass 1,000 yards receiving in 2020. And while these guys are undeniably fantasy difference makers, they all have a major negative that could potentially prevent them from joining the 1,000-yard club. So A.J. Brown, who had 1,217 yards last year, A.J. Brown took the NFL by storm in his rookie season, racking up 1,051 receiving yards on just 84 targets and 52 catches, averaging 2.67 yards route run or yards per route run, and that was 3rd most. And he was a menace in the open field with a colossal 8.9 yards as the catch per reception, which was 2nd most. And Brown made his money on monster plays with a league-high 6 catches with 50-plus yards, and no other player had more than 4. The concern for Brown is his volume on run-heavy offense. Brown's home run plays will likely regress, but he is an ascending player and due for increasing his target share. And next is DeAndre Hopkins. So he's projected 1,148 yards this year. And it feels wrong to admit Hopkins from a lock category, but we can't overlook the unknown factor of his new team and just look at the struggles of Odell Beckham Jr. in his first year with the Browns. As Pro Football Focus Ian Hartitz pointed out in his article analyzing the fantasy impact of players changing teams, Brandon Marshall is the only wide receiver since 2010 to immediately turn into wide receiver one production in year one with a new squad. Hopkins should be second, but some caution is warranted because history in statistics does matter. Next is DJ Moore, who's projected to have 1,133 yards. A second-year breakout for Moore, who recorded an 82.3 overall grade last season, which was 12th best on 130 targets, 9th most. In 15 games, the former first-round pick is a stud after the catch, and he forced 13 missed tackles in 2019, which was 7th most. And his only uncertainty lies with the fact that there's a new quarterback in town with Teddy Bridgewater, who has the lowest average depth of target in the NFL at 6.1 yards last season. Odell is popping up next on this list, and even in an embattled and injury-riddled first season with the Browns, Beckham still labored his way to 1,035 yards. Receiving efficiency was a massive problem, and he averaged a career-low 1.81 yards per route run, and despite seeing a hefty 130 targets, when the capable Kevin Stefanski is taking over the play caller duties, Beckham is a strong bounce-back candidate. Next on this list is Adam Thielen. So with Stephon Diggs in Buffalo, Thielen is now the leader in Minnesota's passing attack with minimal competition for targets. So Thielen's fantasy stock is down after an injury-plagued 2019 season, but remember that he had over 1,200 receiving yards in both 2017 and 2018. He averaged 2.20 yards per route run in those two seasons and had 60 catches for 15 plus yards. Thielen proved that he was over the pesky hamstring injury by pacing the Saints for 7 catches and 129 yards in the Vikings playoff victory. A healthy Thielen should be easily exceeding 1,000 yards. Next is Terry McLaurin. McLaurin joined an elite company by recording an 85.7 overall grade his rookie season. The only others to earn a grade above 85 as rookies was Michael Thomas, Odell Beckham, and Keenan Allen. The sky is the limit for him, and his only question marks are those surrounding Dwayne Haskins. And next is Keenan Allen. So Keenan Allen is a beacon of consistency, currently riding a 3-year streak of 1,000 yards. He had 101 catches of 15 plus yards since 2017, which is third most, only behind Julio and DeAndre Hopkins. His injury year notwithstanding, Allen has averaged over 2 yards per route run in every season since 2015. Widely regarded as one of the NFL's best route runners, Allen would be a lock in the category if it were not for the departure of Phillip Rivers. And to be completely honest, I don't know how much of a departure that really is, considering the state of Phillip Rivers and the team when everything was all said and done. Next is Calvin Ridley. So one of fantasy community's favorite breakout candidates. Ridley is primed to reach 1,000 yards for the first time in his career. Atlanta's passing offense is going to run through its two outside wide receivers in Jones and Ridley. Matt Ryan has a league-high 537 pass attempts to outside wide receivers since 2018, 72 more than anyone else, and still the possibility of Julio hogging too many targets as a potential roadblock to Ridley reaching 1,000 yards. Next is Amari Cooper. So the Cowboys' passing attack ascended to new heights in 2019, and Cooper's excellence was a major contributing factor. His 84.1 overall grade was 9th best, and his 2.29 yards per route ran was 8th, were both career highs as Cooper blossomed into the alpha wide receiver on the offense and averaged 432 yards per game, and most in the NFL. So Cooper's chief obstacle to 1,000 yards is the presence of Michael Gallup and CeeDee Lamb, but neither is likely to challenge him as the Cowboys' number one option just yet. Then we have Courtland Sutton, you know, my guy, who much I really do love to see on this list. Courtland Sutton was another second-year breakout who blew up with an increased workload, jumping from 79 to 115 targets in year 2. He was extremely efficient with 2.08 per route run and excelled at the deep ball, racking up 427 receiving yards on throws beyond 20 plus yards downfield. And a crowded wide receiver room and an unproven Drew Lock are still slight drawbacks for Sutton, but I would still feel like he can definitely breach the 1,000-yard club. And to wrap this segment up, we are going to talk about the rise to fall below 1,000 yards. So Tyler Lockett is on this list. As crazy as it may seem, Lockett joined the 1,000-yard club for the first time in 2019. He is immensely talented and recorded a 81.9 overall grade. And last season, the Wilson to Lockett connection has generated a stellar 127.8 passer rating since 2015 and first among all wide receivers with 100 targets. The only concern for Lockett is Pete Carroll's affinity for the run and stubborn refusal to let Russ cook, essentially. The Seahawks had 481 rush attempts last season compared to 517 pass attempts, which was 23rd in the league, and their rush attempts was third most in the league. And Lockett ranks as the consensus wide receiver 22. Next is Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp's 2019 season was a tale of two halves. He was the Rams' number one option from weeks 1 through 8 with the team's 29% target share after the week 9 bye. Kupp's target share plummeted to 17% in the rest of the way. What iteration of the Rams offense will we see in 2020 is a major unknown right now, putting Kupp at a risk for coming in 1,000 yards. Kupp ranks amongst wide receivers as a consensus wide receiver 21. T.Y. Hilton is on this list as well, as injuries stymied him last season as he limped to a 501 receiving line in 10 games. He wasn't all that productive even when he was on the field, averaging only 1.81 yards per route run. The big playability just wasn't there for Hilton, and he had 87 receiving yards in week 1, but failed to top that mark in any game for the rest of the season. Fantasy owners seem to have forgotten that Hilton was a monster as of recent of 2018, when he averaged 2.54 yards per route run, and the return to stardom to a certain possible, especially with Phillip Rivers likely to elevate his play. However, Hilton will be 31 years old in November, and he ranks as wide receiver 26. Then, of course, there's Juju Smith-Schuster, whose Steelers offense was not good without Ben Roethlisberger in 2019. But additionally, Deontay Johnson and James Washington are going to siphon targets away from Juju Smith-Schuster, and he's a strong candidate for a rebound, but there's concerning factors working against him in 2020. And then last on this list is Devontae Parker, so largely written off as a first-round bust. Parker had a long overdue breakout last season with 1,200 receiving yards, and Parker went nuts after Preston Williams got hurt and racked up 802 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns from week 10 on, while working as the apple of Ryan Fitzpatrick's eye. The upside is there for Parker, but whether he can maintain the level of productivity with Williams on the field and take a major question. Further, Tua Tagovailoa is likely to take reins from Ryan Fitzpatrick at some point in the season, and this chemistry with Parker is a major unknown, and he ranks as wide receiver 28 among all wide receivers. So there you have it. That is your list, and we're going to keep rocking with it after we take another break. We'll be back soon. This is the GSMC.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And we're back, GSMC Fantasy Football Nation, with some more fantasy football conversations, topics, and discussions. Now, before we get into our next segment, I wanted to go ahead and drop in this little tidbit of information. Did you know we had some social media that you couldn't follow? We have GSMC Fantasy Football on Twitter and on Facebook. And it would be a great big help if you guys come check us out and come socialize with us. Drop some knowledge onto us. We can have open discussions. We can talk about the latest trades, the latest transactions in the league. We can talk about who you should start on what week or how you should handle FanDuel or DraftKings or whatever the case may be. You can hit us up on Twitter at GSMC Fantasy Football and that on Facebook as well. Come ask us some questions, man. We love interaction and we want to be able to hear straight from you guys, and that would be awesome. But without a doubt, here is the next segment here, as we're going to be talking about actual fantasy football rules and regulations if you are new. So if you have never been involved in a fantasy football draft, fantasy football league, it can be a little bit intimidating at first, trying to figure out what exactly are the key parameters on what you need to be looking forward to in order to have really good draft success and have a successful first season. And maybe you're not a big time numbers guy. Maybe you watch the NFL as a hobby and you like a certain team or you like your home team and that's really all you're into. Fantasy football, of course, is a whole nother spectrum of trying to keep in touch with what's happening around the league, and you have to be a little bit more locked in with different transactions, different moves, and things like that, that for most part, people who aren't into fantasy football may not want to embark on. So that's the first thing. Know who you are when it comes to this stuff, because not everybody can play fantasy football, right? I know my dad likes to watch Sunday Ticket. He watches Sunday football. He watches Monday night, and he puts on Thursday night, and he may fall asleep through it. But I know my dad is not a fantasy guy. He watches football. He may watch different teams play. He may watch the big storylines, but he is not going to keep up with a league or a team created in fantasy football just to see what happens. At least as far as what he's shown me, I don't think he would want to do that. But, you know, there's always opportunities to change. So let's use my dad as this scenario branches out even further. So if there was a rule set I'd give my dad on the first day of him joining a fantasy football league and their draft is about to happen in a week, what are some rules that we can give him in order to basically prepare him for the best possible outcome he can have in a draft for fantasy football in snake or auction draft? And ESPN has provided some 10 simple rules, and we're going to go over them. And we're going to look if we even agree with some of these rules. So, number one on this list is draft for value. They say your starting lineup is going to consist of a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, a flex, which can be a wide receiver, running back, or tight end, a defense/special teams, and a kicker. And that's 9 spots in total using ESPN's default settings. Your first 9 picks should not fill your starting lineup. Not all positions in fantasy football lineups are created equally. And the writer is here to tell you that none is more important than the running back spot, and it's really hard to find excellent and reliable running backs in fantasy football, as evidenced through a couple of key stats. To wit, in 2019, there were a total of just 27 running backs who averaged at least 12 fantasy points per game, and minimum 8 games were played, as compared to 39 wide receivers to accomplish the same threshold. Beyond that, the bottom falls out rather quickly amongst running backs, and the 20th highest scoring running back in the season in fantasy football last season managed just 41.9% of total points scored by the top running back, Christian McCaffrey. The 20th highest scoring wide receiver managed 58.7% of Michael Thomas's season-long total as the number 1 wideout. And both McCaffrey and Thomas has historical great seasons, so this isn't some outlying fluke. You'll learn this early. There is a supply shortage of reliable running backs in fantasy football, and they matter a lot. Speaking generally, you're going to want to build your roster around running backs, and as well as getting to know, wide receivers. So I take this as truth and almost in a fantasy Bible. Because if there was a fantasy Bible, a rule of commandment, shall I say, for fantasy football, this has to be number one. Never look at a running back in the mouth. Because you need to realize that this game revolves around running backs farther than any other part of that football that we watch. Fantasy football is so running back dependent that if you look at how people feel sick about certain running backs getting paid what they are, it's because we see value, the NFL can just replace. But we cannot replace the value that running backs bring to us in fantasy. So their value is insurmountable. And the ones that are really, really talented and can catch and run, those guys are next level. That's why when people see Kamara and you see Ezekiel Elliott when he decides to catch the ball, Saquon is the next coming of Walter Payton or something like that. Like, it really does matter. People look at this stuff for real. And you have to be aware of this. So people are scouting running backs left and right. If there's any position that you're going to scout heavily on and somehow drop yourself into a fantasy draft with no other prior knowledge, running back is probably the one you're going to want to do, because those are your guys who are going to make or break you at the end of the day. You always want to make sure you have good value at the running back spot, because you never know when one's going to go down. You never know what your draft will look like, to where maybe you can start actually stockpiling on some running backs and maybe get some trades going to round out your team better, but at least you have options at that position. Number 2 on this list that ESPN provided was target wide receivers early too. So wide receivers do matter a lot. And if you look at the ADP, which is average draft position, you'll find that 4 of the top 10 selected players are wide receivers, with the 6 remaining being running backs. As a matter of fact, 35 of the top 40 players in terms of ADP are running backs or wide receivers. So, which illustrates the point that people are trying to hammer home here. Takes a lot of running backs and wide receivers early. So yes, you'll be likely to be drafting players, several of them from your bench, before you come close to completely filling out your starting lineup. And that's just how it is, because it's more important to have depth at these top 2 positions than it is to basically have a full set of your starting lineup and then get into your bench. Because if you don't draft for value, and if you don't draft people like wide receivers and really, really talented running backs, you are going to struggle really heavily when the seasons come down to a few different players just having outstanding games and you don't have really any of them. Or you may have 1 or 2 guys who are really, really good and you didn't decide to prepare yourself by drafting for value. So I do agree with this sentiment as well. Always look out for the wide receivers too, because they are the second bell cows in this whole system. And number 3 is quarterback patience. So if you go through the 2019 scoring leaders in fantasy football, it'll be hard to miss that 5 of the top 10 overall scorers play quarterback, which is part of the exact reason you should be patient at quarterback in your draft. To put it in its simplest form, there are lots of good quarterbacks in fantasy. A total of 23 quarterbacks average at least 15 fantasy points per game in 2019, minimum 8 games played, meaning that not only are there plenty of sufficient options to be a starter, but also to find your backup. Given that you start only 1 quarterback in your lineup, there are going to be quality options available on the waiver wire and at almost all times. So while a dominant quarterback can go a long way in fantasy football, like Lamar Jackson, consider this. Of the 20 players who appeared in the most championship teams in 2019, only 2 of them were quarterbacks. So many can carry you. Be patient. I agree, but here's the caveat to this. If you are not, right, this is for people who are coming in early. This is people who are first timers. If you are not a first timer and you've been around the block and maybe you want to get yourself an edge and really look into some of this stuff, you can always find a quarterback that can give you an edge if you look at certain trends in how these quarterbacks are going. Everybody's looking for the next Lamar Jackson and the next Patrick Mahomes, because when Patrick Mahomes had his MVP season and didn't win the Super Bowl, they're like, who is the next Mahomes? Well, people just thought maybe I should just draft Mahomes again. I did the same thing. I drafted Mahomes again because I believe that he was by far and large the best quarterback available. Their offense was insurmountably the greatest offense we've seen in a while as far as just output and potential. So, and he's young and he's electric. So I figured I would use up some of my draft stock and get him. So I did that. And then, of course, Patrick Mahomes struggled along with many players on the Chiefs this year in the regular season, and they didn't really have their 100% chemistry down. They weren't all the way together until the back half of the year, and then, of course, the Super Bowl run and all that. That goes to show you, of course, Lamar Jackson was taken in late rounds last year, and his value was insurmountable. But here's the ticket. You're not going to find value in a quarterback that you draft in round 3 or 4. You're not getting any value from that. Your value is when you get somebody late and they basically shoot their projections through the water. Like Christian McCaffrey was probably going 3rd to 6th overall in a draft, and he still shot his projections out. That's how good of a season he had. Michael Thomas, same thing. But Lamar Jackson was probably drafted maybe 8th round, and now all of a sudden he has propelled himself that he's probably going to be one of those guys that gets drafted in the 3rd round at quarterback. And honestly, there's just no way his value is going to meet or exceed what he already has done, because it never works that way. There's data to back this up. It just doesn't work that way. So that's my only caveat. Try to find somebody who can be the next version of what you saw, because that brings value. All right. 4th on this list is, so how about tight end? So, all right. We've checked off 3 of the 4 major positions in fantasy, so we have to address tight ends. A few important notes. If you typically start only 1 tight end per week, there are very few tight ends who end up putting consistently robust point totals, and they are seldom used in your flex spot. And to paint that with numbers, in 2019, a total of 45 wide receivers scored at least 150 points during the season, and while 31 running backs did the same, a total of just 9 tight ends managed to do that feat, with only Travis Kelce surpassing 250 points, and no one else came close. So as we head into 2020, people are optimistic that there will be better depth at the tight end spot than we've seen in quite some time, but still a small number of tight ends are definitely worth paying a premium on. Kelce is a top 20 to 22 selection, and George Kittle will likely go within the next round or so. So what's the tight end strategy? Pretty simple. If not Kelce or Kittle early, remember that there is always solid value players all over the board this season, so you don't have to rush. Number 5 on this list is to be more patient on defense and special teams and kickers. So get used to this happening every draft you take part in. From your 1st to your 50th, someone will get anxious and eager to take a top defense or special teams and use a mid-round pick on them, and maybe an 8th rounder, maybe a round or 2 sooner, who knows, but we have a body of evidence that shows that the least predictable position in fantasy football is defense and special teams. Last season's top picked defense and special teams averaged, the Bears finished with 16th best overall. The 49ers D finished 3rd overall, were drafted just 30.5% of leagues going into the season. It's hard to predict how defense will fare year over year, and even when the personnel largely remains the same, much of the upside in defense and special teams scoring is attached to touchdowns and turnovers, 2 stats that aren't quite as simple to replicate year over year. So as for your kicker, just draft one in the final round and target one who plays a lot. Plays on a good offense. Playing a multiple round premium on them won't cost you your draft, but there will be really good lottery tickets, more so than on the second, and available for you to bypass. So consider in 2019, Greg Zuerlein had an ADP of 86th overall amongst kickers, and he was top amongst kickers. So that was just one spot behind Dak Prescott, who was the second highest scoring quarterback, and well ahead of other fantasy stalwarts such as Austin Hooper and Kyler Murray. Zerline finished in the 12th highest scoring kicker. Don't do it. So, last but not least, upside matters late here. When you're getting the final round of the draft, keep these words in mind. Upside. Fantasy football is laced with surprise standouts every season, particularly from players who slide only because we haven't seen from them yet. And let's say you find somebody reading a preview piece about Denver Broncos, and early word is that rookie wide receiver KJ Hamler is going to make an immediate impact, or be Vulnerable reporter out of Washington says Steven Sims Jr.'s late surge in 2019 will carry over into this season. Any kernel of information that suggests that a busy role could ensue this season is enough to take a late round flyer on a player. Surprise stars from 2019 included A.J. Brown of the Titans, DJ Shark Jr. of the Jaguars, and Terry McLaurin of Washington. Each of them went undrafted in at least 88% of leagues and went to finish as top 30 wideout this season. A few names to monitor this season for late in your draft include Damian Harris, N'Keal Harry from the Patriots, Michael Pittman Jr., who I told y'all about, and Justin Jefferson from the Vikings, who I told you about. So to wrap up this segment, I think a lot of these are really, really good, and we'll probably continue talking more about beginner tips, because fantasy football is not just about the hardcore, but sometimes it's about people who just want to get their feet wet, and that's okay too. So we're going to take our final break here, and then we're going to come back and wrap the podcast up. This has been the GSMC.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Okay, we're back, fantasy football fans and GSMC listeners across the podcast airwaves. We are about to end off this podcast on a topic of tight ends. Dun, dun, dun. Tight ends, man. We're talking about the big boys who catch the ball too. So we're talking about who is on the do not draft list for tight ends of 2020 and the ones that we want to try and avoid. So there are very few players who are true do not drafts under any circumstances, but they told us we do not hate players, we hate ADPs. And in 99% of the case, the reason for placing a player on the do not draft list is because of his average draft position. And there will be a focus on this list, and the writer features tight ends that many of us like and would love to have. It's just that they cost too much. And let's take a look at 2020's do not draft tight ends. You can see this year's do not draft list for other players on Fantasy Pros as well. We're going over tight ends right now. So Darren Waller for the Las Vegas Raiders. That's going to be really, really hard to try and keep up with, the fact that they're called the Las Vegas Raiders now. Like, I do a horrible job talking about the Chargers. So I usually just say the Chargers instead of saying the Los Angeles Chargers, because San Diego has been ingrained in my mind from my whole life knowing football in the NFL. So that's always been a difficult change. So for some reason, the Los Angeles Rams wasn't that hard. I guess because they were the Los Angeles Rams before. But I digress. If you remember any type of research from last season, you'll recall that Darren Waller was a stud, and before the entire fantasy community caught on, Waller, from this writer's perspective, was his default last position player drafted in every league, even in ones where he'd already taken a tight end. He paid off handsomely with the tight end 6 finish. The problem for 2020 is that he's being drafted to what he did last season. Unfortunately, his numbers are bound to regress. Waller saw 117 targets last season. He caught 90 of them, good for a 76% catch rate. And even if we assume the numbers don't drop much, the targets will the Raiders be drafting, Henry Ruggs, Brian Edwards. They signed Jason Witten, who has no business being on a football field in the year 2020, but nevertheless will see some snaps. They still have Foster Monroe, and they added a jack-of-all-trades player in Lynn Bowden. So we're certain that Derek Carr will be benched for Marcus Mariota at some point in the season. That whole host of added variables works against Waller repeating his 2019 case. So, we don't think that Waller will be bad, of course. This all comes down to cost. If you have to spend a 5th-round pick on Waller, but he really is any better than Austin Hooper or Hayden Hurst or Jared Cook or Mike Gillespie or any other tight ends going many rounds later, we would rather have Waller than those guys, of course. But do I want to pass on somebody like DK Metcalf or DeAndre Swift to lock up Waller? We'd rather throw darts at finding this year's Darren Waller, of course. And this is what I was talking about last segment, is the thing about finding value is that you don't find value in early rounds. You find value in the late rounds because that's where value presents itself. And you have to, sometimes throw darts in the dark. Next is Hunter Henry from, let's get this right now, the Los Angeles Chargers. All right. Although he finished as tight end 7 last year, Hunter Henry only averaged 12.3 points per game. And if he could repeat that, he would perhaps be a reasonable value in the 7th round. And, we don't want reasonable value. We want plus value. So remember when I was talking about Hunter Henry about a month ago, and we did a whole tight end podcast talking about what he's capable of. And Hunter Henry was a touchdown guy. And what I mean by a touchdown guy, he is somebody whose value is very, very dependent on touchdown conversion. If he does not scoring touchdowns, his yardage and catches aren't really something that you need to hold near and dear to you. And although he finished, tight end 7 last year, his points per game average really makes a lot of sense. That means he is very much touchdown dependent. And he played 26 games over the last 3 seasons, and he has extrapolated targets from 2019, put him at about 100 targets. So that would have been a career high. Now entering his 5th professional season, Hunter Henry will be receiving passes from Tyrod Taylor and eventually Justin Herbert. The good news is that during his 3 seasons as a starter in Buffalo, Tyrod Taylor targeted tight end Charles Clay frequently. The bad news is that Sammy Watkins' 96 targets in 2015 were the most any individual player saw from Tyrod Taylor. Tyrod Taylor is going to average fewer than 30 pass attempts per game. Henry is, at best, 4th in line for targets behind Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Austin Eckler, and Henry has a lot of competition for targets. In the lengthy injury history and at quarterback, he'll either have some who can run instead of checking it down to him or a rookie with accuracy issues. So we should probably teeter our expectations for Hunter Henry and have him lower on our draft boards as of right now. Next is TJ Hawkinson out of Detroit. So this one is not about price. I would scold anyone. This is the writer speaking. I wouldn't scold anyone for taking him in 10th or the 11th round. He just doesn't want him because he's a poor bet to be a useful fantasy asset. Hawkinson played in 12 games last season. He was a monster week 1 against Arizona's historically bad tight end defense, finishing overall tight end 2. He posted just 1 double-digit effort the rest of the season and never finished higher than overall tight end 14. To be fair, Hawkinson is extremely athletic, and the tight end position is difficult to learn. And the writer understands that the desire to believe he's taking a step forward as a sophomore, he's just not buying it. So Hawkinson is going ahead of Dallas Goedert, Janu Smith, and Mike Gillespie, just to name a few. And all three of these guys, as much as some others, showed more promise last season than Hawkinson. And we've seen these three guys put together multiple tight end 1 weeks. We haven't seen that from Hawkinson at all, except for week 1. So Hawkinson is competing with Kenny Galladay, Marvin Jones, Danny Amendola for targets, not to mention the Lions' 2 quality receiving backs. And Hawkinson actually had a 14% target share as a rookie. He had a 66.9 snap share in just 12 games. He was set up to at least make some noise as a rookie, and he did absolutely nothing. So is it the possibility that Hawkinson takes snaps forward this season? Absolutely. And if he does, it will be someone else's team, because for the writer, he would rather place his bets on tight ends similar on cheaper ADPs than have proven what they can and can't do on the NFL field. So those are some of his gripes and guys that he's trying to avoid for tight ends this season in the NFL and do not draft lists. And it usually has to do with ADPs, because in fantasy football, we do not hate players for how they play on the field, because most times we can tell when the players are good. Just because they're good players in the NFL, though, does not mean they're good for fantasy purposes. And I wanted to go ahead and take a look at tight ends again and talk about what I feel like are guys that we should be targeting this year, and who I will be personally trying to look at for value in later rounds. And let's go ahead and get into it. So the first on this list, I'm telling you right now, you're hearing it from me, Jared Cook has potential to be tight end number 1, and he is not going to be taken in a lot of rounds. And here is why. People forget about how the Saints run their offense majority of the time, and people just think Michael Thomas takes so much of the share, so much of the catches, and then you have Alvin Kamara, and then you have usually another running back in there that takes some carries away. But outside of that, you don't have a lot of options that Drew Brees tends to spread the ball around to on this offense for the past few years. And it's really telling that they have not been able to have a solid wide receiver to kind of emerge out of this offensive structure they've had for the past 3 years, until, of course, they got Emmanuel Sanders, who does throw a wrench into my theory. But Jared Cook had a really, really good end of the year last year, and it was unfortunate that he got knocked out of the playoffs due to an injury. But Jared Cook was cooking, for lack of a better term. He was cooking for the second half of the year. When Drew Brees finally came back and they were able to build chemistry, him and Drew finally found something that clicked, and it was working tremendously. And although Alvin Kamara struggled last year in that offense due to injuries in his own right, I don't think that the target shares really hurt one another, because Alvin Kamara's targets are way different. And I believe that Alvin Kamara takes a lot of stress away from Jared Cook to help him succeed. And Alvin Kamara gets his points historically through a lot of yards after making somebody miss and elusiveness and things like that, let alone just being a supreme bell cow, so to speak. He is a more finesse player, although he does have some power running game ability in him, as we've seen last season. When he was healthy, he was able to hold his own. So I think Jared Cook is a good option, and if things go well, he's a tight end number 1 finisher candidate week to week. And I wouldn't hold anyone against them going out and getting him just at the right ADP. And then I'm a fan of Hayden Hurst in Atlanta, because I think Atlanta is a place to where they don't really have a third option. And I think that Hayden Hurst has to be their logical third option, as they let go of Austin Hooper and took him to Cleveland. So it only makes sense. Maybe they don't know how his ability will translate and maybe he doesn't get immediate chemistry with, the likes of Matt Ryan and being alongside Julio and being alongside all their other wide receivers, of course, fantasy guy that we are all waiting to see come out on top here, of course. Fantasy is weird. And while you wait for players to potentially have breakout seasons, you always seem to stress it out more and more, and you keep trying, but maybe it's time to give up. However, Calvin Ridley is not a guy that most people want to give up on because we've seen the talent. We know he's a talented guy, but he is in a really bloated offense sometimes. And Julio Jones does take up a lot of the share in targets. But the thing about Calvin Ridley is he's a touchdown machine. Now, of course, Austin Hooper found a way to really thrive. And it wasn't like he was like tight end number one or anything, but he really showcased his ability as a tight end. And I think a lot of people are expecting Hayden Hurst to be able to supplement that role. And if you find value in Hayden Hurst in later rounds, it's probably something that you should look into. But with that said, those are my two, and we're going to wrap up the podcast right there. Thank you guys for sticking around with us and listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Don't forget to please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you choose to listen to us. 5 stars, please. And I'd like to go ahead and remind you to follow our social media so you keep in touch. We talk fantasy football news, rankings, and all different types of stuff online via Twitter and Facebook, GSMC Fantasy Football. This has been Ethan speaking. I'll see you all next week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.